Today I'm going to present a paper. It's basically an extension of a paper I presented more than 5 years ago at this exact same conference, possibly in the same room. It's a paper on trans and job instability at the intersection of gender and ethnicity in the UK. So what are we talking about when we talk about job instability? It's a, researchers interested in job instability basically are very close to researchers interested in precarious work and new forms of employment contracts. But instead of looking at the type of contract, so whether the contract is temporary, part-time, etc., instead we're looking at what happens to the employment trajectories, the careers of the workers. So regardless of their types of contracts. So basically in that context, what we're doing is we're interested in the same transformations as researchers who are interested in the rise of precarious work, but we're not interested as much as in ex ante insecurity. We're much more interested in ex post observed instability in people's careers. So this is what I'm going to focus on today. So this literature has produced a lot of findings. The two key findings are job stability decreased for men across liberal market economies, Canada, the US, the UK. So we're seeing shorter and shorter job tenure duration, so people staying for a shorter and shorter amount of time with the same employer and changing jobs much more often. But this is only for men. For women, the findings are slightly different. We're finding a pattern that has been called masked instability, where job stability for women has increased over time, over the last 40 years, meaning that women are less and less likely to interrupt their a given job, and less likely to spend prolonged amount of times outside of employment. And instead of being related to precarious work dynamics, this is much more rooted in changing norms and behaviors around employment participation of mothers right after childbirth. So instead of being laid off, quitting, changing jobs after the birth of a child and spending a long time out of the labor market, mothers increasingly keep their jobs and have the prevalence of extended spells outside of employment among young mothers is less and less frequent. And so this trend for women has kind of canceled the trend for men. So we've seen a decrease in job stability for men, an increase for women. And so in the aggregate, nothing seems to have changed. But the drivers of each of these two trends are very different. What we can conclude is that the rise of precarious work, the unionization, all these transformations, organizational transformations that we're expecting to lead to more precarious work also seem to have led to greater instability in people's careers. It's not so surprising, but it took 20 years for the literature to kind of document this properly. So what this literature has not been done, because it's been kind of like mired in these like very methodological or like untangling different group-specific trends between men and women, what this literature has not done so far is narrowing in on the experience of specific subgroups. So in the precarious work literature, we know that racialized workers, especially racialized and first-generation immigrant women, have been especially impacted, or we have a high prevalence of precarious employment, insecure employment, temporary work, for example, among these groups of the population. But how this translated into greater job instability has not been extensively documented yet. So what we're asking here is, are racialized and immigrant men experiencing the same decrease in job stability as non-racialized, non-immigrant men? And are racialized and immigrant mothers experiencing the same increase in job stability as white non-immigrant mothers? So are we seeing this masked instability pattern across different racial group and ethnic groups and immigration groups? We're using the UK as our case study. And I'm also trying to see if I had a time here. Okay. A little piece of context I want to mention here. When we're interested in job instability, a key source of one key driver of rising job instability is expected to be precarious work, flexibilization, growing labor market insecurity, but instability can be also, so basically it means mobility, so leaving one's job, changing firms. A lot of these employer changes can be voluntary as well. People do quit, and we've seen a rise in quits as much as a rise in layoffs. what I'm talking, it's just a short disclaimer. We can talk about it a bit more in the question period. But when I'm talking about instability here, yes, some of it may be involuntary, but a lot of it may be also voluntary. So I'm not trying to imply that all of the instability we're observing is just involuntary. What this means, we can talk about in the question period. Okay. What are some reasons why we would see differences in job instability by race immigration status, So why are we focusing on these group differences? So on one hand, we may expect immigrants and racialized individuals to have greater job instability, so higher risks of job separation than non-racialized, non-immigrant individuals because of their overrepresentation in precarious jobs and less performing firms or departments. We also may expect greater job instability among these groups, especially among immigrants, because job mobility, and we're coming back here to the voluntary part of mobility. Job mobility is part of the economic integration process of first-generation immigrants. Very often, immigrants in the first few years on the labor market of their host countries are mismatched. They're overqualified. They're in bad jobs, and then by going back to education, changing jobs, they end up leaving overqualification sometimes, finding better matches, better jobs, and so this requires mobility, which will look like instability, right? On the other hand, we may expect racialized and immigrant individuals to experience greater job stability for a few reasons that are related to restrictions to voluntary mobility. For example, in the presence of hiring discrimination, it's going to be harder for individuals to change jobs because every time you want to be hired, well, you'll be facing restricted options because of the discriminatory employers. Likewise, racialized individuals whose social and employment, social networks and professional networks are more restricted in terms of being part of homogeneous ethnic networks, may have less opportunities for upward moves because their immediate network gives them access to a more homogeneous set of jobs. And so in these two cases, we're going to expect more stability because of the presence of less opportunities to move around, basically. So these are hypotheses. They haven't been properly documented, but also the big question we can ask is, has any of this changed over time, over the last 30 to 40 years, which would determine whether we're seeing different trends in job stability between racialized and non-racialized individuals and immigrant and non-immigrant individuals? We're asking empirically, I don't think I have time to go through all the literature, but it seems like racialized and immigrant individuals from the limited literature we have on the topic are experiencing more instability, but it's not clear in which direction this would have changed. We don't really have studies on this. So that's a gap I'm trying to fill. Now, what about gender differences? So in this paper, we really want to take an intersectional perspective, so consider gender and ethnicity together. So are we expecting to see greater instability among racialized and immigrant women specifically? There are some reasons to think that this is the case. Racialized and immigrant women are more likely to be employed in precarious and bad jobs, as we've stated in the intro. But also, immigrant women specifically often arrive as tide movers, so they're the dependent of the primary applicant as part of a family unit where the primary applicant is an economic immigrant and their spouse, often in different sex couples, the woman is a tide mover who's not the primary applicant. And so these workers, tide movers, there's an extensive literature documenting how they're facing slower career progressions. And so in this specific case, as we said, immigrants often experience so mobility, job mobility is a huge part of the economic integration process of immigrants, and tide movers may be less likely to complete these kind of moves, leave overqualification, and so immigrant women may experience more stability, less mobility. So the kind of reverse of the other one. And then across different immigrant groups, there are, so for example, and there's an extensive literature specific to the UK, which is our case study documenting this. We see very different employment rates among women from different ethnic groups. So Black Caribbean mothers typically in the UK historically Black Caribbean women historically arrived through economic immigration programs and were the primary applicants, whereas it's not really the case for, or it's less likely to be the case for Pakistani and Bangladeshi women. And so we would expect that this would translate in different types of job stability patterns. Again, there's a very limited literature on the relationship between any of these dynamics and job stability. And did any of this change over time? It's not clear, but especially when we think about tide movers dynamics, this is a dynamic that is persisting over time. So I'm not aware of any research that says that these dynamics would have attenuated. And so these dynamics are kind of possibly counterbalancing the drivers of masked instability. And so we may expect, based on this explanation and the first explanation, that we're not going to see this masked instability pattern, rising job stability among immigrant women to the same extent as we're seeing rising job stability among non-immigrant women. Okay. To answer this question, we're using data that covers the last 30 years UK data from the labor force survey. We have a question on job stability with the same wording over that whole period, which is rare. So it's a question asking people, how long have you been with your current employer? So one of the most widely used questions to capture job stability. We have detailed data on ethnicity and year since arrival for immigrants. There's 100,000 observations per quarter, not per month. That's a typo. So we're using a single quarter per year. We have tons of observations, which allows us to conduct an analysis disaggregated by gender, ethnicity, and immigration status. So a proper intersectional analysis. And we have 5 ethnic groups. So white, non-racialized, Black, Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi, and others, because that's a very small group where we put everybody else. And we focus on 25 to 54 years old parents, because the masked instability pattern that I've been referring to it is mostly related to differences between mothers and fathers. And so just so that we don't have another intersection here, yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to show is change over time in job stability across across these groups. Just as a piece of context, here we're seeing in the previous slide, I don't know why, but the resolution on this slide is not super good, but we're seeing a rise in the share of workers who are racialized workers, part of the different groups that I mentioned. So the share of all of these groups in the labor market increased in the UK over the last 30 years. And the proportion of those who are foreign-born decreased over time for almost all groups except for Black individuals. Okay. So these are regression results controlling for a set of sociodemographics. What we're seeing is change over time in average job tenure duration. All the curves start at 0 on the y-axis, meaning that's the baseline year. So any change you're seeing over time, and the x-axis are the years, are increases or decreases in job stability. So in average job tenure duration over time, over the 30 years of data. So this is for fathers by immigration status and ethnicity. So the key conclusion here is for the bottom middle graph shows a decline of more than 1 year in average job tenure duration for white immigrant and non-immigrant men, and a similar decrease, slightly larger for Black men, but similar decrease for other groups of immigrant men in average job tenure duration, concentrated in the 1990s and early 2000s, meaning that for immigrant men and non-immigrant, non-racialized men, we're seeing a decrease in job stability, across the board. So not much difference. For non-immigrant men who are racialized, we're not really seeing the same thing. I'll get to why in a minute. Very quickly, brief decomposition exercise where we're trying to determine whether this is driven by the rise in the proportion of workers holding non-standard employment contracts or temporary contracts that should lead to more instability. It's partly a driver for Black men, but not to a greater extent than white non-immigrant men. And so this doesn't seem to be a key driver of group differences. The reason why we're not seeing as much change for Other groups of men is because they started off much lower. So racialized non-immigrant men had very low job instability at baseline, so there was not much room to go lower. Now, and that's going to be my last slide. My last slide of results for women. We're seeing the middle panel in the bottom, white immigrant and non-immigrant women, an increase in average job tenure duration. So this is the masked instability pattern, a rise in average job tenure, a rise in job stability for white immigrant and non-immigrant mothers. Are we seeing the same thing for other groups of racialized and immigrant mothers? No. And there's a decrease for Black mothers. And so the other ethnic groups here in the UK are not experiencing the same increase in job stability as white immigrant and non-immigrant mothers. And so just two key points here. Masked instability, we're finding mostly the same pattern across the board for men. Not to the same, but the story for women is different. Black men and Black women seem to have a also specifically different experience of job instability, which has been rising over time across the board. So thank you.